What are the largest known volcanic eruptions in history?
Scientists measure volcanic eruptions by the amount of material that a volcano ejects into the atmosphere. Based on this measurement system, the largest eruptions include, in descending order of strength: 1 at Yellowstone Park in the United States, c. 600,000 BC, another at Toba, Indonesia. About 74,000 BC, Atambara, Indonesia, eruption in AD 1815, Santorini, Greece, in 1470 BC. Loki, Iceland, in AD 1783, which also produced the largest known lava flow in recorded history. And another in Indonesia, at Krakatau, in AD 1883. The eruption in Yellowstone is hard to fathom. The volcano, which would have been located in present-day Wyoming, left a crater that measures 30 by 45 miles and released about 10,000 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put this into perspective, consider that the next largest eruption, that at Toba, released 1/10 that amount, or 1,000 cubic kilometers. The one at Tambora released 1/10 of the Toba amount, 100 cubic kilometers. All of the others released about 10 cubic kilometers of earth debris into the atmosphere. The May 18, 1980, eruption of Mount St. Helens in southwestern Washington state is also considered among the largest known eruptions in history and is the largest eruption in the modern history of the 48 contiguous United States. Mount St. Helens released a comparatively small amount of material, 1 cubic kilometer, but the damage was great after the volcano erupted. Much of the region was blanketed in ash, miles of forest were devastated, and the North Fork of the Toutle River was laden with ash and other volcanic debris up to 600 feet deep. The eruption claimed 57 lives.
Why is Moby Dick considered the greatest American novel?
The 1851 novel by Herman Melville, 1819–1891, which opens with the familiar line "Call me Ishmael," has been acclaimed as one of the greatest novels of all time. Many regard it as the best American novel. Of course, determining the best is a purely subjective matter, and Melville's work has many worthy rivals for the distinction, but Moby Dick remains a compelling and finely wrought work in spite of the fact that it was not appreciated in its day. The story of a whaling captain's obsessive search for the whale that ripped off his leg. Moby Dick is both an exciting tale of the high seas and an interesting allegory, interpreted as the human quest to understand the ultimately unknowable ways of God. The work first received notoriety some 30 years after Melville's death.
Who were the Danes?
The Danes are the Scandinavian people of Denmark. Their origins date as far back as 100,000 years. Beginning at about the time of Christ, c. 30 AD. The Danes were organized into communities that were governed by local chieftains. During the 6th and 7th centuries they participated in the Viking, pirate, raids of England, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. These last three are sometimes referred to as the Low Countries. In about 950 Denmark was united by King Harald II, also called Harald Bluetooth, c. 910 c. 985. Who 10 years later was converted to Christianity and thereafter fostered its spread. The Vikings gained control of England in 1016, and the Dane warrior Canute became King of England, and of Denmark. The Danes ruled England until 1042.
Who was the first person to reach the South Pole?
Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, 1872–1928, was first to reach the South Pole, in December 1911. Before earning this distinction, he had achieved another first sailing the Northwest Passage, from 1903 to 1906. Amundsen's desire to be an Arctic explorer had been with him almost his entire life. As a teen, he is said to have slept with his bedroom windows open year-round in order to become accustomed to the cold. When he was a young man of 21, he turned his attention away from the study of medicine to making an Arctic passage. He recognized that many of the previous, and failed, attempts to travel to the Arctic shared a common characteristic. The commanders of these expeditions had not always been ship's captains. He resolved to become an experienced navigator and soon took jobs as a deckhand on various ships. In 1897 Amundsen was chosen as the first mate on the Belgica, the ship that would carry the first Belgian Antarctic expedition under the command of Adrien Gerlache de Gomery. 1866–1934, also on board was the American Dr. Frederick Cook, 1865–1940, who had been on one of Robert E. Peary's, 1856–1920, earlier Arctic expeditions and who would, in 1909, dispute Peary's claim that he was the first to reach the North Pole. This was the same news that Amundsen would hear as he was preparing to make the North Pole. Upon learning of the success of Peary's 1909 expedition, Amundsen shifted his sights to reaching the South Pole instead, and quietly began to lay plans to do so. In fact, it was not until his expedition, which left Oslo in September 1910, was underway that he telegraphed his announcement back to Norway that he was in fact headed to the South, not the North Pole. As it turned out, a race was on between the Norwegians and the British. Shortly after Amundsen had set sail, naval officer Robert Falcon Scott, 1868–1912, had left England at the head of an expedition to reach the South Pole. The Norwegians landed at Ross Ice Shelf, Antarctica, on February 10, 1911. It was not until 10 months later, On December 14, 1911, on a sunny afternoon, that they raised their country's flag at the spot their calculations told them was the South Pole. Before heading north again, they celebrated their achievement with double rations. When British naval officer Robert Falcon Scott's expedition arrived at the South Pole on the morning of January 18, 1912, they found the Norwegian flag flying over it. On their way back, the crew died due to bad weather and insufficient food supplies. Amundsen's Norwegian expedition arrived safely at their base camp on January 25, 1912.
Why was the Bill of Rights added to the U.S. Constitution?
The United States Constitution, ratified in 1788, contained few personal guarantees. In fact, initially there was some opposition to the new Constitution, much of it based on the lack of specific guarantees of individual rights. It was the father of the Constitution and future President of the United States, James Madison, 1751 to 1836, then a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, who in December 1791 led Congress to adopt the 10 constitutional amendments that became known as the Bill of Rights. Most of the rights focus on individual liberties that had been cited in the Declaration of Independence as having been violated by the British. Most of these specific grievances had not been addressed by the Constitution. Therefore, the Bill of Rights was added to cover this ground.
Who were the Lombards?
The Lombards, too, were a Germanic tribe. They are believed to have originated on an island in the Baltic Sea. In the last century BC, the Lombards moved into Germany and gradually continued southward so that by AD 500, they were settled in present-day Austria. From 568 to the mid-700s, they controlled much of Italy, posing a serious threat to the papal supremacy, so that in 754, Pope Stephen II, d. 757, appealed to the powerful Franks for help. By this time the Franks were ruled by Pepin III, called Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768, who was able to defeat the Lombards. The northern region of Italy, Lombardy, is named for them.
How did ancient societies interpret catastrophic weather events?
Different cultures developed wholly unscientific explanations for dramatic weather events or other natural phenomena, explanations typically rooted in the existing mythology or folklore of its people. For example, the ancient Maya, in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and in parts of Central America, believed that earthquakes were the gods' way of thinning out an overcrowded population. Indians in central Mexico are believed to have worshipped the grasshopper or locust after swarms destroyed their crops. One Japanese myth maintained that the entire island string rested on the back of a giant catfish, who would grow restless and flop around when the gods were displeased, resulting in an earthquake. According to Hawaiian myth, the volcano goddess Pele causes Mount Kilauea to erupt whenever she has a temper tantrum.
Who are considered the founding fathers of the United States?
The term is used to refer to a number of American statesmen who were influential during the revolutionary period of the late 1700s. Though definitions vary, most include the authors of the Declaration of Independence and the signers of the U.S. Constitution among the nation's founding fathers. Of the 56 members of the Continental Congress who signed the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. The most well-known are John Adams, 1735–1826, and Samuel Adams, 1722–1803, of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin, 1706–1790, of Pennsylvania, John Hancock, 1737–1793, of Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, of Virginia. The 39 men who signed the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787, include notable figures such as George Washington, 1732–1799, who would go on, of course, to become the first President of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, 1755–1804, who, as a former military aide to George Washington, went on to become the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and James Madison, 1751–1836. Who is called the father of the Constitution for his role as negotiator and recorder of debates between the delegates. At 81 years of age, Benjamin Franklin was the oldest signer of the Constitution and was among the 6 statesmen who could claim the distinction of signing both it and the Declaration of Independence. The others were George Clymer, 1739–1813, Robert Morris, 1734–1806, George Read, 1733–1798, Roger Sherman, 1721–1793, and James Wilson, 1742–1798. Patriots and politicians conspicuous by their absence from the Constitutional Convention of 1787 were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were performing other government duties at the time and would each go on to become U.S. President. Samuel Adams and John Jay, 1745–1829. Who were not appointed as state delegates but who continued in public life, holding various federal and state government offices, including governor of their states, and Patrick Henry, 1736–1799, of Virginia, who saw no need to go beyond the Articles of Confederation, 1777, to grant more power to the central government. Henry's view on this issue foreshadows the discontent that crested nearly 100 years later when 12 Southern states including Virginia, seceded from the Union, causing the Civil War, 1861–65, to break out. Adams, Franklin, Hancock, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and Henry. These are the names that come to mind when the words Founding Fathers are uttered. Each of them had a profound impact in the political life of the United States even beyond their starring roles as patriots and leaders during the American Revolutionary era. However, it's important to note that in many texts and to many Americans, the term Founding Fathers refers only to the men who drafted the U.S. Constitution, since it is that document that continues more than 200 years after its signing to provide the solid foundation for American democratic government.
What does Remember the Alamo mean?
The saying was a rallying cry for Texans in their war for independence from Mexico. The movement for independence had begun in the winter of 1835–36 when the people of Texas decided to cut off relations with Mexico, and soon turned into a war when the Mexican government sent a force of some 4,000 troops, under the command of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, 1794–1876, to squelch the rebellion. As the Mexican army approached, the force of about 150 men who were determined to defend the city of San Antonio retreated to the Alamo, a Spanish mission built in the previous century. There they were joined by another 50 men, but were still no match for the Mexicans, who kept the Alamo under siege for 13 days from February 23 to March 6, 1836. The Texans, low on ammunition, ceased to return fire. On the morning of March 6, Santa Anna's troops seized the Alamo. The fierce frontiersman, Davy Crockett, 1786–1836, among them, are believed to have fought using the butts of their rifles. All the Texans who fought that day at the Alamo died. Meantime, General Sam Houston, 1793–1863, had assembled his forces, and with the rallying cry "Remember the Alamo," and their fellow Texans who had bravely fought and died there, he set out to face the Mexican army and secure independence. This he did, at San Jacinto, Texas, on April 21, 1836. In a quick and decisive battle that had caught Santa Anna's troops by surprise. The following day the Mexican general was captured and made to sign a treaty giving Texas independence.
What is the Big Bang Theory?
It is a theory of the origin of the universe. According to the Big Bang Theory, the universe began as the result of an explosion that occurred between 15 and 20 billion years ago. Over time, the matter created in the Big Bang broke apart, forming galaxies, stars, and a group of planets we know as the Solar System. The theory was first put forth by Edwin Hubble, 1889–1953. who observed that the universe is expanding uniformly and objects that are greater distances are receding at greater velocities. In the 1960s, Bell Telephone Laboratories scientists discovered weak radio waves that are believed to be all that remains of the radiation from the original fireball. The discovery further supported Hubble's theory, which puts the age of the universe between 15 and 20 billion years. Astronomers have observed that the galaxies are still moving away from each other and that they'll probably continue to do so forever, or at least for about the next 70 billion years. If the galaxies did come together again, scientists believe that all of the matter in the universe would explode again. In other words, there would be another Big Bang. And the result would be consistent with that of the first. It would produce a universe much like the one people live in today. Another supporter of the Big Bang theory is British theoretical scientist Stephen Hawking, 1942. In 1988, Hawking, who is known for his theories on black holes, gravitational forces in space, made by what were once stars, published his ideas in the best-selling book A Brief History of Time, From the Big Bang to Black Holes.
What were the highlights of the Ming Dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming Dynasty. 1368 to 1644, was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself, meaning bright or brilliant. Architects working during this period produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. Ming porcelain, bronze, and lacquerware are coveted collector's items today. Additionally, the novel and drama flourished. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people on the horizon. In 1644, the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912. Nevertheless, it was the Ming, and not the Manchu, who formed the last great and truly Chinese dynasty.
What is the Intifada?
Intifada means uprising in Arabic and refers specifically to two recent periods of intense and regular violence between Palestinians and Israelis in the disputed territories of the Middle East. The First Intifada began in 1987 and did not subside until a peace settlement was brokered between the two sides in Oslo, Norway, in 1993. The Second Intifada began in September 2000. The violence of that uprising continued into 2005 despite ceasefire vows from Arab, Palestinian and Israeli leaders. The second wave of violence was marked by almost daily suicide bombings of Israeli targets, including markets, restaurants, buses, and other public places. Israelis view the intifadas as acts of terrorism, claiming the lives of thousands of Israeli citizens. Palestinians in general and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the militant Islamic group Hamas in particular consider the tactics part of their war of national liberation, a decades-long struggle to establish an autonomous Palestinian homeland in Israel. In the waves of violence, casualties were high on both sides. More than 4,000 died in the Second Intifada alone. The cycle of conflict appeared endless. Palestinian acts of violence were met with retaliation from the Israelis, which incited further violence from the Palestinians. Hopes for a lasting peace were raised again in February 2005 when Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, 1935, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, 1928, held a summit meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. They declared a ceasefire agreement and their intentions to resume negotiations, as outlined in the Roadmap for Peace. But the militant Palestinian group Hamas immediately claimed the verbal agreement was non-binding. Indeed, Hamas, which was largely responsible for the Intifada, posed major roadblocks to an end of violence in the region. Before they would put down arms, the group demanded total Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as well as the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Hamas was also dissatisfied with Israel's agreement to release only 900 of the 8,000 Palestinians held prisoner by Israel.
What was the Iran-Contra affair?
It was a series of actions on the part of U.S. federal government officials, which came to light in November 1986. The discoveries had the immediate effect of hurting President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, whose policy of anti-terrorism had been undermined by activities initiated from his own executive office. Following in-depth hearings and investigations into who knew what, when, Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, 1912, submitted his report on January 18, 1994. Stating that the dealings with Iran and with the Contra rebels in Nicaragua had violated United States policy and law. The tangled string of events involved Reagan's national security advisors Robert McFarlane, 1937, and Admiral John Poindexter, 1936, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, 1943. Poindexter's military aid, the Iranian government, and Nicaraguan rebels. The U.S. officials evidently had begun their dealings with both the Iranian government and the Nicaraguan rebels with the goal of freeing 7 Americans who were held hostage by Iranian-backed rebels in Lebanon. President Reagan had met with the families of the captives and was naturally concerned about the hostage situation. Under pressure to work to free the hostages, McFarlane, Poindexter, and North arranged to sell an estimated $30 million in spare parts and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran, then at war with neighboring Iraq. In return, the Iranian government would put pressure on the terrorist groups to release the Americans. Profits from the arms sale to Iran were then diverted by Lieutenant North to the Contras in Central America who were fighting the dictatorial Nicaraguan government. Congress had already passed laws that prohibited U.S. government aid to the Nicaraguan rebels. The diversion of funds certainly appeared to violate those laws. The Iran-Contra affair led to North's dismissal and to Poindexter's resignation. Both men were prosecuted, though the hostages were freed. Reagan's public image was seriously damaged by how the release had been achieved. During the Iran-Contra hearings in 1987, National Security Commission officials revealed that they had been willing to take the risk of providing arms to Iran in exchange for the safe release of the hostages because they all remembered the U.S. government's failed attempt in 1980 to rescue hostages held at the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. Nevertheless, the deal with Iran had supplied a hostile country with American arms that could then be used against the United States. In 1987 Iran did launch an offensive when it attacked Kuwaiti oil tankers that were registered as American and laid mines in the Persian Gulf. The United States responded by sending in the Navy, which attacked Iranian patrol boats. During this military initiative, the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down a civilian passenger jet, killing everyone on board.
When did the first Africans arrive in the British colonies of North America?
In 1619 a Dutch ship carrying 20 Africans landed at Jamestown, Virginia. They were put to work as servants, not as slaves. Though they had fewer rights than their white counterparts, they were able to gain their freedom and acquire property, which prompted the development of a small class of free Negroes in colonial Virginia. For example, there is record of an Anthony Johnson arriving in Virginia in 1621 as a servant. He was freed 1 year later, and about 30 years after that he imported 5 servants himself, receiving from Virginia 250 acres of land for so doing.
What was the National Bank Act?
The National Bank Act of 1863 was designed to create a national banking system, float federal war loans, and establish a national currency. Congress passed the act to help resolve the financial crisis that emerged during the early days of the American Civil War, 1861–65. The fight with the South was expensive, and no effective tax program had been drawn up to finance it. In December 1861, banks suspended specie payments, payments in gold or silver coins for paper currency. People could not convert banknotes into coins. The government responded by passing the Legal Tender Act. 1862, issuing $150 million in national notes called greenbacks. But banknotes, paper bills issued by state banks, accounted for most of the currency in circulation. To bring financial stability to the nation and fund the war effort, the National Bank Act of 1863 was introduced in the Senate in January of that year. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase, 1808 to 1873, aided by Senator John Sherman. 1823 to 1900, of Ohio, promoted it to the legislators. The bill was approved in the Senate by a close vote of 23 to 21. The House passed the legislation in February. National banks organized under the Act were required to purchase government bonds as a condition of startup. As soon as those bonds were deposited with the federal government, the bank could issue its own notes up to 90% of the market value of the bonds on deposit. The National Bank Act improved but did not solve the nation's financial problems. Some of the 1,500 state banks, which had all been issuing banknotes, were converted to national banks by additional legislation, passed June 1864 to amend the original Bank Act. Other state banks were driven out of business or ceased to issue notes because of the 1865 passage of a 10% federal tax on notes they issued, making it unprofitable for them to print their own money. The legislation created $300 million in national currency in the form of notes issued by the national banks. But since most of this money was distributed in the East, the money supply in other parts of the country remained precarious. The West demanded more money, an issue that would dominate American politics in the years after the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. Nevertheless, the nation's banking system stayed largely the same despite the Panic of 1873 until passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913.
What was the Hollywood blacklist?
In 1947, studio executives assembled at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York put together a list of alleged communist sympathizers, naming some 300 writers, directors, actors, and others known or suspected to have Communist Party affiliations or of having invoked the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination when questioned by the House Committee to investigate un-American activities. The Hollywood 10 who refused to tell the committee whether or not they had been communists were Alva Bessie, Herbert Biberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dmytryk, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and Dalton Trumbo. The film industry blacklisted the Hollywood 10 on November 25. and all of them drew short prison sentences for refusing to testify.
What is no drama?
It is the oldest form of traditional Japanese drama, dating to a.D. 1383. It is rooted in the principles of Zen Buddhism, a religion emphasizing meditation, discipline, and the transition of truth from master to disciple. History and legend are the subjects of no plays, which are traditionally performed on a bare wooden stage by masked male actors who performed the story using highly controlled movements. The drama is accompanied by a chorus, which chants lines from the play. The art form was pioneered by actor-dramatist Moto Kiyosimi, 1363–1443, when he was 20 years old. Zimi had begun acting at age 7 and went on to write more than half of the roughly 250 no dramas that are still performed today.
How disastrous was the San Francisco earthquake?
The quake of 1906 struck at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, and registered 8.3 on the Richter scale. 20 seconds of trembling were followed by 45 to 60 seconds of shocks. The quake cracked water and gas mains, which resulted in a fire that lasted 3 days and destroyed 2/3 of the city. The destruction and loss of lives were great, as many as 3,000, of San Francisco's 400,000 people were killed. The entire business district was demolished, 3 out of 5 homes had either crumbled or burned. 250,000 to 300,000 people were left homeless, and 490 city blocks were destroyed. The quake was a milestone for American journalism, the offices of the city's newspapers. The Examiner, owned by William Randolph Hearst, 1863 to 1951, The Call, and the Chronicle had all burned. But the first day after the disaster, the 3 papers joined forces across the Bay in Oakland to print a combined edition, the California Chronicle Examiner. Across the country, Will Irwin, 1873 to 1948, of the New York Sun, who had been a reporter and editor at the San Francisco Chronicle from 1900 to 1904, wrote a story titled The City That Was, which he completed from memory alone. It was picked up by papers around the country and became a classic of journalism. The San Francisco tragedy demonstrated the newfound ability of the American press to create an instant national story out of a local event. The Bay Area was hit again by a sizable quake in 1989. As millions tuned in to watch the World Series at Candlestick Park outside San Francisco, the TV cameras began to shake. Because of media coverage of the baseball game, the earthquake had literally been broadcast live around the world. Once again, fires resulted from broken gas mains, and the damage was extensive. The so-called Loma Pietra quake registered 7.1 on the Richter scale. Claimed 67 lives, and damaged $15 billion worth of property. San Francisco's Marina District was particularly hard hit, at least in part due to the fact that the area was built largely on landfill, including debris from the 1906 quake. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 remains the worst to ever hit an American city.
Who was the first to write a modern novel?
While there are differing opinions on the answer to this question, it is generally accepted that the credit for the novel as we know it belongs to Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes, 1547–1616. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, in two parts, 1605 and 1615. It was the first extended prose narrative in European literature in which characters and events are depicted in what came to be called the modern realistic tradition. Considered an epic masterpiece, Don Quixote had an undeniable influence on early novelists, including English novelist and playwright Henry Fielding, who wrote the realistic novel Tom Jones, 1749. Don Quixote is also said to have anticipated later fictional masterpieces, including French novelist Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, 1857, Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, 1868–69. And American writer Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884.
Have all nations of the world granted women the right to vote?
No, in a few nations women remain disenfranchised. By the 1990s, women had a legal right to vote everywhere in the world except in 6 Middle Eastern countries: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates, as well as in Brunei, a small oil-rich country in Southeast Asia. In 2001, Bahrain extended equal voting rights to women, and in 2003 Qatar did the same. But a traditional interpretation of Islamic law kept Muslim women from voting in a few conservative Persian Gulf states. Kuwaiti lawmakers proposed limited women's suffrage in spring 2005, but the measure was not approved. There was mounting pressure, from inside and outside the Muslim world, for this to change. The issue was an important focal point for the Human Rights Watch, an international watchdog group. In October 2004, a high-ranking Egyptian cleric spoke out on the contentious issue, saying, "It is the right of a Muslim woman to vote for and speak her opinion about whoever serves public or greater interests." He went on to clarify that he was talking about Muslim women in all Muslim countries, in Egypt, Kuwait, and others. Suffrage for women has been won country by country and decade by decade. Further, within many countries, rights have been extended only gradually. For example, beginning with local elections. The first nations to extend broad voting rights to women were New Zealand in 1893, Australia, and South Wales in 1902, and Finland in 1906. In the 1910s, women in several European and Scandinavian nations, including Austria, Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Russia, won the right to vote largely as a result of World War I, 1914-18. The 1920s added not only the United States and the United Kingdom to a voting status equal to men, but about a dozen other nations, including the former Czechoslovakia and Sweden. Every decade since added more nations to the tally, so that as of 2004 only a few nations denied women the right to vote.
What happened to the Celts during the Roman Empire?
The Celts were an Indo-European people who by 500 B.C. had spread across what is now France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and the British Isles. And by 200 BC they had expanded as far as present-day Bulgaria and Greece. When the Romans conquered much of Europe, about 300 BC, many Celts were absorbed into the Roman Empire. However, those Celts living in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, southwest England, and Brittany, in northwestern France, were able to maintain their cultures. And it is in these regions that people of Celtic origin still live today.
What was the Battle of the Bulge?
The term refers to the December 16, 1944, German confrontation with the American forces in the Ardennes Mountains, a forested plateau range that extends from northern France into Belgium and Luxembourg. Even though Germany appeared to be beaten at this late point in the war, Hitler rallied his remaining forces and launched a surprise assault on the American soldiers in Belgium and Luxembourg. But Germany could not sustain the front, and within 2 weeks the Americans had halted the German advance near Belgium's Meuse River, south of Brussels. The offensive became known as the Battle of the Bulge, because of the protruding shape of the battleground on a map. The Ardennes were also the site of conflict earlier in World War II. In 1940, as well as in World War I, in 1914 and 1918.
What is the era?
The era stands for the Equal Rights Amendment, a constitutional amendment proposed by Congress in 1972. It stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. In proposing the amendment, Congress gave the states 10 years in which to ratify it. But in 1982 only 35 of the necessary 38 states had approved the amendment, which then died. The failure to ratify the ARO was the result of disagreement over how the language would be interpreted. Supporters believed the amendment would guarantee women equal treatment under the law. Opponents feared the amendment might require women to forfeit the financial support of their husbands and require them to serve in the military.
What does Viva Zapata mean?
It was the cry that went up in support of the rebel General Emiliano Zapata, 1879–1919. Whose chief concern during the Mexican Revolution, 1910–20, was the distribution of land to the people. An advocate of Mexico's lower classes, Zapata began revolutionary activities against the government of Porfirio Diaz. 1830–1915, as early as 1897. Zapata rose to prominence in helping the liberal and idealistic Francisco Madero. 1873–1913, overthrow Diaz in 1911. With Madero placed in power, Zapata promptly began pressing his co-conspirator for a program to distribute the hacienda, large estate, lands to the peasants. Rebuffed by Madero that same year, Zapata drafted the agrarian plan of Ayala and renewed the revolution. Madero's government never achieved stability and proved to be ineffective, prompting a second overthrow in 1913. Victoriano Huerta, 1854–1916, seized power from Madero, whom he had helped put into office, and in the chaos surrounding the coup, Madero was shot and killed. But Zapata refused to support Huerta and remained a leader of the revolution, continuing his crusade for the people who supported him with cheers of Viva Zapata, meaning Long Live Zapata. The bitter fighting of the revolution continued, and soon those who had supported the slain Madero, including Zapata and Pancho Villa. 1878–1923, threw their backing behind another revolutionary, Venustiano Carranza, 1859–1920. In 1914 Carranza's forces occupied Mexico City and forced Huerta to leave the country. No sooner had Carranza taken office than the revolutionaries began fighting among themselves. Zapata and Pancho Villa demanded dramatic reforms, and together they attacked Mexico City in 1914. 5 years later, and 1 year before the end of the revolution, Carranza's army ambushed and assassinated Zapata in his home state of Morelos.
What was the Cuban Missile Crisis?
The 1962 events, which happened very quickly, nevertheless constituted a major confrontation of the Cold War, 1947–89. After the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, when the United States backed Cuban expatriates in an attempt to oust Fidel Castro. 1926, the Soviet Union quietly began building missile sites in Cuba. since the island nation is situated just south of Florida. When U.S. reconnaissance flights detected the Soviet military construction projects there, it was an alarming discovery. On October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, demanded that the Soviet Union withdraw its missiles from Cuba. Kennedy also ordered a naval blockade of the island. 6 days later, the Soviets agreed to dismantle the sites, ending the crisis.
The word crusade. Why do Jews, Christians, and Muslims all claim the same Holy Land?
Palestine, in Southwest Asia, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, is the Holy Land of Jews. Since it was there that Moses led the Israelites after he led them out of slavery in Egypt, c. 12th century BC, and where they subsequently established their homeland. It is the Holy Land of Christians because it was where Jesus Christ was born, lived, and died. And it was the Holy Land of Muslims, because the Arab people conquered Palestine in the 7th century and, except for a brief period during the Crusades, it was ruled by various Muslim dynasties until 1516, when it became part of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine, which covers an area of just more than 10,000 square miles, is roughly the size of Maryland. Palestine's capital, Jerusalem, is also claimed as a holy city by all three religions. Jews call it the City of David, or the City of the Great King. Since it was made the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel in about 1000 BC, Christians regard it as holy. Because Jesus traveled with his disciples to Jerusalem, where he observed Passover. It is the site of the Last Supper, and just outside the city, at Golgotha, Jesus was crucified. c. 30 AD. Muslim Arabs captured the city in 638 AD, just after Muhammad's death. And, like the rest of Palestine, it has a long history of Muslim Arab rule. Jerusalem, which is now part of the modern state of Israel, is home to numerous synagogues, churches, and mosques. It has also been the site of numerous religious conflicts throughout history. Comes from the Latin word crux, meaning cross, and crusaders were said to have taken up the cross. The Crusades began with an impassioned sermon given by Pope Urban II, c. 1035–1099, at Clermont, France, in November 1095. Earlier that year, Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, 1048–1118, had appealed to Urban for aid in fighting back the fierce Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks preceded the Ottoman Turks. The Seljuks were named for their traditional founder, Seljuk. Seeing the expansion of the Turks, who were Muslim, as a threat to Christianity, the Pope agreed to help. Not only did Urban rally support for the Byzantines in staving off the further advances of the Turks, he also advocated that the Holy Lands should be recovered from them. While the Arab Muslims who had previously controlled the Holy Land had allowed Christians to visit there, The Turks tolerated no such thing. Urban feared that if Palestine were not recovered, Christians would lose access to their holy places altogether. But Urban also viewed the Crusades as a way of unifying Western Europe. The feudal nobility there had long fought against each other. He believed a foreign war would unite them behind a common cause as Christians. Further, he hoped the Crusades would unite Western with Eastern, Byzantine, Europe behind one goal. If successful, the expeditions would also expand the Pope's moral authority across a greater region. En route from Clermont to Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, where the crusade was set to begin in August 1096, Urban continued to preach his message at Limoges, Poitiers, Tours, Aquitaine, and Toulouse, France. The message found broad appeal. Even if it appealed to something other than the people's religious sensibilities. Some of those who answered Urban's call took up arms not for the Christian cause, but for their own personal gains, such as acquiring more land, expanding trade, or recovering religious relics. Many peasants took up the cross to escape hardships in 1094. Northern France and the Rhineland had been the site of flooding and pestilence, which was followed in 1095 by drought and famine. The First Crusade actually turned into two. A peasants' crusade, which had never been Urban's intent, had gone ahead of the official expedition, and many lives were lost. It ended in failure. But the planned expedition, called the Crusade of Princes, ultimately succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099. Western Christian feudal states were established at Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, all of which were placed under the authority of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But Urban did not live to see the recovery of the Holy Land, and the Christian hold on Palestine was not to last. As the Muslims refused to give up the fight for control of lands they too considered to be holy. The second, 1147-49, third, 1189-92, fourth, 1202-04, fifth, 1217-21, sixth, 1228-29, seventh, 1248-54, and 8th, 1270, crusades were prompted by a mix of religious, political, and social circumstances. The Crusades ended in 1291, almost 200 years after they had started, when the city of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in Palestine, fell to the Muslims, ending Christian rule in the East. Yet another crusade, in 1212, was particularly tragic, called the Children's Crusade. The expedition was led by a young visionary who had rallied French and German children to believe they could recover Jerusalem, since, as poor and faithful servants, they would have God on their side. As the children marched south across Europe, many of them died even before reaching the Mediterranean coast. Some believe that the crusade was sabotaged, resulting in the children being sold into slavery in the East.
What have been the deadliest tropical storms in the world?
The deadliest tropical storms are not hurricanes but rather the unnamed supercyclones that sweep out of the Bay of Bengal. In the Indian Ocean, striking the densely populated Indian subcontinent. These storms have been known to kill 100,000 people or more. The fatalities numbered more than 300,000 when a 1970 cyclone struck East Pakistan, Bangladesh. That storm is still the deadliest cyclone to hit the region. But more recent Indian cyclones, which usually occur in April through June and September through November, have sometimes reached supercyclone status. An April 1991 storm packing 160-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves swept over Bangladesh's low-lying coastal plain. There was no place for residents to seek shelter from the advancing sea. An estimated 140,000 people perished and 10 million were left homeless. Property damage climbed to more than $2 billion. In October 1999, another devastating cyclone struck the Bay of Bengal region. It was the strongest and deadliest since the 1991 disaster. 10,000 died and more than 1 million people lost their homes.
What happened in the Oklahoma City bombing?
The attack took place at 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, when a truck bomb exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Of the 168 people who were killed, 19 were children. Another 500 people were injured. The blast, which investigators later learned had been caused by a bomb made of more than 2 tons of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, sheared off the front half of the 9-story building and left a crater 8 feet deep and 30 feet wide. Nearby buildings were damaged or destroyed, including a YMCA daycare center where many children were seriously injured. The force of the explosion shattered windows blocks away. Survivors of the blast and others in the vicinity began rescue efforts right away. Eventually, more than 3,600 people from around the country participated in rescue operations, including police, firefighters, and members of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Police and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, agents arrested members of an American right-wing militant group who were suspected of wanting to avenge the April 19, 1993, FBI/ATF raid on the Branch Davidian religious compound in Waco, Texas. Former Army buddies Timothy J. McVeigh, then 27, and Terry L. Nichols, then 40, were indicted on August 10, 1995, on 11 charges each. The two were tried separately and convicted in federal court. McVeigh was found guilty of murder and conspiracy in June 1997, and a federal jury sentenced him to death. Nichols was later found guilty of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter. But in January 1998 the jury deadlocked on the sentence, which was then to be decided by the judge. In early June it was decided that Nichols would serve life in prison. Officials believe the Murrah Federal Building was targeted in the anti-government attack because it housed 15 federal agencies, including offices of the Social Security Administration, SSA, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, as well as several Defense Department offices and a government-run daycare center.
What was triangular trade?
Triangular trade refers to the various navigation routes that emerged during the colonial period. There were numerous triangular paths that ships traveled. Ferrying people, goods, both raw and finished, and livestock. The most common triangular route began on Africa's west coast where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners, and traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits, and traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows: 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the triangle began again. 2. Lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the triangle began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the capture of Africans and their forced migration to the Western Hemisphere.
Was Mata Hari really a spy?
When Dutch-born Margaretha Zell MacLeod, 1876–1917, was arrested in Paris on February 13, 1917. There was scant hard evidence that this woman, known throughout Europe as Mata Hari, was actually a spy for the Germans during World War I, 1914-18, but there was plenty of evidence that she had long consorted with the enemy and had been paid by them, but for exactly what was never discovered. Nevertheless, the testimony heard by the jury over 2 days in July in a closed Parisian courtroom was enough to convince them that this former exotic dancer, who could count as her lovers a who's who of European men, was, in fact, a spy. She was sentenced to death at age 18, the result of a matrimonial advertisement. She married a middle-aged colonial captain in the Dutch army, John Rudolph Campbell MacLeod. He was posted to duty on the island of Java, where his young and beautiful wife, now 21 years old, learned not only the Malay language, but native dances as well. Her Javanese friends named her Mata Hari, meaning the Eye of the Dawn. Upon returning to Holland, Mata Hari secured a separation from her husband and moved to Paris, where she enjoyed a life of excess and soon became known as an exotic Hindu dancer. She performed throughout Europe, all the while engaging in liaisons with powerful and wealthy men. In 1914 she moved to Germany, where she is believed to have been trained as a spy in Antwerp. With World War I on, Mata Hari returned to Paris. She was permitted to enter France since she owned property there and was a citizen of neutral Holland. She renewed her ties with men of influence and in that capacity collected information for the Germans. The Allied nations kept a close eye on her, and, suspecting her of espionage, set a trap for her. She became a double agent. The French sent her to Spain to work, but there she reportedly met regularly with German intelligence agents. When the Germans ordered her back to Paris, Allied officials, having intercepted a German cable for her, awaited her return. They arrested Mata Hari, who was found in possession of a check from the Germans. At her trial, a report compiled by the French and holding Mata Hari responsible for the deaths of some 50,000 Allied soldiers, was brought into evidence. She was killed by firing squad on October 15, 1917, the war still more than a year from ending.